So we're going to talk about the material that we need to really get into Chapter 1. This material is not really covered in the book because, as I mentioned last class, the book assumes that you already have had an introductory statistics course. And so this material, while it's not in the book, is actually going to be quite important for us to be able to really understand what we're doing the rest of the class, and also for you to be able to do your projects. So we're going to start off talking about data, and we're going to ask a very basic question, which is, what is data? And we're going to say that data is just any collection of recorded values of our observations that have context. And so context is really the relevant phrase here that's of interest to us. What is context? Well, it turns out that context in statistics really means something very similar to what it means in everyday language. It's just the basic background information about the data. So when we say something has to be taken in context, we mean that you have to know the situation, right, to be able to make sense of that. And the same thing is true for data sets. We have to know the data set situation. And why is that important? Well, if you ever think about a situation where you know two people who have seen exactly the same situation, and yet they have totally different accounts of what happened, that gives you an idea of why we need context, because very often two people can take exactly the same data set and get very different results, very different conclusions, depending on what they're looking at, what their objective is, and sometimes the source where they're getting the data from. And just to give you a very simple hypothetical of how something like this could happen, it's actually quite common. Let's look at a question we might have. We might ask the question, are people who work at Embry-Riddle drunks? Okay? And so how would we answer that? Well, we're going to go out and collect some data. Let's do a statistical study. So I go ahead and I collect data on 20 employees at Embry-Riddle. I know for a fact that these people are employees because I pay them money to see their ID, to call HR, and so this is known for a fact. And now I go ahead and I have a medical professional administer a blood alcohol test using a machine that's been calibrated. I know it's working correctly, and I get the following results. Okay, so I go ahead, I number the participants 1 through 20, write down their names, and then give them the blood alcohol test and record the result. And you can see that a number of them are legally drunk. And in fact, if we looked at the data, let's just say that 15 of those 20 employees were legally drunk. What conclusion would I come to based on this data? Well, one conclusion I could come to just based purely on this data, I might say, well, obviously there's an unacceptably high percentage of Embry-Riddle workers that have an alcohol abuse problem. And in fact, I think the government should stop funding Embry-Riddle. We don't want to support an institution like this. Do you agree with that conclusion? Well, you may or may not, because it really depends upon some facts that I didn't tell you about the data. So for example, I didn't tell you why I took the data. Let's suppose I'm a senator of a state that has a competing school. I didn't tell you where I took the data. Suppose I collected it outside of a bar. And I also didn't tell you when I collected the data. And let's just suppose I collected it at 1 a.m. on a Saturday after a big celebration at Embry-Riddle. Now you might come to a very different conclusion, right? And so I use this example to illustrate an important fact, which is that usually data is just thought of by people as being a collection of numbers, and it's not. It's more. Now, what is context, okay? Well, context really consists of us answering 6 basic questions, and they're the same questions that reporters ask when they go out to investigate a story. Okay, first we want to know who were the data collected from. Okay, in other words, who was involved in this study? What was the data collected? What is it that we're collecting data on? Why was the data collected? What was the purpose of the study? And finally, there's some other questions. Where, how, and when was the data collected? And of course, it's very often the case that you can't answer all 6 of these questions. However, you really have to be able to answer the first 3 in order to use a data set for a statistical study. Now, I want to go back and just mention one thing really quickly, which is the fact that data sets always have 2 parts. So first of all, there's usually a spreadsheet or some sort of file that just consists of the recorded values. Okay, that's what we would formally call the data set. And usually the structure of the data set gives us information on the who and what, right? Usually the first column consists of the who. Okay, it's telling us who's in the sample that we collected data on. And usually the columns give us the values of each of the things that we're collecting data on, or the what. Now the context is given by something that's sometimes called metadata. And this is usually where the background information is. Okay. So let's look a little more at the who and the what, because those really play a vital role in any sort of study. So the who really describes who is in our sample. And it goes by a couple of different names depending on the type of study we're looking at. So if we're doing a survey, sometimes we call the individuals in our sample respondents. If we're doing an experimental study, we might call them subjects or participants. If we're dealing with inanimate objects, like we're looking at products from some assembly line or a batch process, we might call them experimental units. And sometimes if we're looking at an observational study, so in other words, it's a study where we're just looking at data that someone else has compiled, we call the people in the sample by whatever label they might have. They might be customers, students, employees, whatever. The important thing to understand, however, is that the who does not refer to who is doing the experiment. We could care less about who is conducting the experiment, whether it's a person from Harvard or Tallahassee Community College. Is totally irrelevant as long as the study's being done correctly. Now the what is really telling us what data we collected from the individuals in the sample. In other words, the what are the things that we're writing down information about. Okay. And so we actually give this a name. We usually call the things or the what's that we're collecting data on variables. And so it's kind of useful to think of a picture to illustrate what's going on, because this is such an important concept. So we think about a study, we always have a population. In other words, this is the collection of all the individuals that we're interested in studying. Of course, we generally can't study all the individuals because populations very often are quite large and they're just not accessible. And so what we do instead is we take a little chunk or a subset, we call a sample. And the who in this case is whoever's in the sample. So here we have these 5 things in our sample. This is our who. Then we go ahead and we get information from the individuals in our sample, and that's the what. So the variables are the things that we're taking down information about from each individual in our sample. So how do we get to data sets? Where do we find them? How do we actually start to work with them? We want to start looking at this. So the primary source for the majority of data sets in this class are going to be housed in Canvas. So we get to them by first of all going to the module section of Canvas, and then we go to the data section in modules. And so if we go ahead and do that, go to Canvas, and then we'll go to our course page, and then go to modules where all the files for the course are stored. And if you go to the data set subsection, you'll see all the data sets we have. And in this case, I just have one class roster. Let's go ahead and open it up. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and click on download class roster. That'll download the data set to my computer. Downloads sometimes go to different locations. So you noticed perhaps that my downloaded file is down here. If I click on it, it will open up. Sometimes downloads can be accessed at the top of the web page. And if you're not sure where your downloads are, you can just go to your download folder. So usually in your main menu, you have a bunch of files you can get to quickly. Downloads will be one of them. And you can see, sure enough, there's the file. I'm not going to bother opening it up from here because I already have it at the bottom of my screen. So I'm just going to do that. I think I just closed out my browser there. So let me open it back up again. Okay. And so, in any case, we're going to go ahead and open up that file. Let me just do this real quick. Okay. And the thing we want to do now that we've downloaded to our computer is we want to save it to our computer, and we want to notice the location. So probably the best thing to do is just create a dedicated folder where you can download all of your data sets for this class. So in my case, for example, I'd go to Save As. Okay. I'm not going to change the file type, but I'm going to go ahead and just create a folder. So in this case, I have a Math 412 folder, and I would create, a data sets folder, which I already have. And you can see I've already stored the file in here from before, so I won't bother to do that. But probably getting some sort of folder system like this is a good idea. Okay, so now you have the folder stored on your computer with the data. Just to give you some context, okay, this is a data set that consists of all of the students in my two Math 412 sections. It was compiled by me a couple of days ago from data provided by the registrar. So now that we have our file downloaded and available to us, we want to open it up inside StatCrunch. So first we're going to get into StatCrunch. So let's go ahead and do that. We get to StatCrunch by going to My Lab and Mastering. And I'm going to go ahead and click on the orange tab to get us in. And then on this left-hand menu, you're going to notice the StatCrunch tab, which I'm going to click on. You can download data sets in the textbook, which we're not going to do very often, or we can go to the StatCrunch website, open that up by clicking here, and then we can import the data set. And notice that StatCrunch has an Excel-like look. Okay, it looks kind of like a spreadsheet. And so what we're going to do in order to import this data set is we're going to click on Data, and then click on Load from File on my computer. Okay, that's all on this top little image here, which will open up another window, and we're going to find that data set on your computer and load it in. So let's see how this works. So I'm going to go to Data, Load, from File, on my computer. Notice that there are a lot of options, and one of the things you can do at the end of the session is you can save the data set. And next time you go in, you just click on My Data and it'll be saved. But this is a new data set that we haven't worked with yet in Excel, so we have to import it from the computer. Go ahead and click on that. And there's a lot of stuff here going on. We're just not going to worry about it. All I'm going to do is I'm going to choose the file. Actually, I'm going to go to this correct folder here, not just a download. And I've chosen it, and now I'm going to open it up. And you can see a little preview of the file, okay? And I'm not going to mess with any of these options in between or any of this. All I'm going to do is go to the very bottom and just say Load File, and that's it. And so you can see what happened. Now it's opened up in StatCrunch, and I can work with it. And that's how we do every file. We find it on Canvas, we click on the data set, and then we click on the download link, then go ahead, save that to someplace on our computer. Then we open up StatCrunch, and we import that data set from that location on our computer. Okay. And so I want to talk a little bit next about what you might call experimental design and data collection. And this really kind of boils down to the different types of studies we can do and the different ways in which we can do sampling. So we start off with the types of studies. We first of all have observational studies. These are the most common studies. These are studies where we're simply observing subjects or we're using data that someone else has collected. It's important to understand that you can't get cause and effect relationships from an observational study. So if you're only looking at, say, smoking and mortality rates, just those two things from that single study, if you saw that a whole lot of smokers had a very high mortality rate, then you could not conclude there's a cause and effect relationship. Okay. You can conclude causality from observational studies, but you need more information. Just the observational study alone does not allow you to do that. And there are basically three types of observational studies. I wrote two types, and I want to include time series in here, so I'm going to change that when I post the notes. The first is a cross-sectional data. So the way I think of it is I think of a population kind of going through time, okay? And cross-sectional is basically cross-sectional data with respect to time. I'm taking a cross-section of time. So I'm taking a sample from the population at a specific time point. Now, kind of the opposite of that is I can look at a cohort. In other words, I can look at a group of people from a population and follow them through time. And that's called a longitudinal study. Usually you're having a whole lot of subjects and it's for a short period of time. And that's contrasted with something that we call a time series. And usually a time series is where we look at one individual, and very often it's an inanimate object, whereas longitudinal studies tend to be on human subjects. So we're collecting data on just one individual, usually inanimate, over many regularly spaced time intervals. So financial data, for example, is very often time series. We might look at a stock price, every month for 1 year. Whereas longitudinal is where we might look at the blood pressure of subjects that we've given a certain drug to over a couple of months. And of course, everyone is familiar with surveys. So this is just where we're basically taking data from a sample of people by means of a questionnaire, and we're trying to estimate some population attributes. Maybe the percentage of people who are for a specific candidate or who have a position on a certain social issue, something of that type. And these are very different than experimental studies. So experimental studies are essentially trying to determine the effect of a treatment. And these, in fact, can be used to establish cause and effect relationships. So the idea is we start off with two groups, a control group and a treatment group. And the way we get that group is we take a random sample of people usually, and we do what's called random assignment or randomization. In other words, I randomly select people from the treatment group for the treatment group. And generally what we do is we generally like to choose the people for the treatment group in such a way that the things that might affect our results are kind of balanced out between the treatment group and the control group. So for example, if I have 4 females and 4 males, let's say the red are males, the green are females, I would randomly select 2 males for the treatment group and randomly select 2 females for the treatment group. And now gender is not going to be a factor that will affect our results, okay? So we try to do random assignment, and we also try to balance out the factors that could affect our results other than just the treatment itself. And there are 5 different types of sampling methods I'm going to talk about. These are going to be relevant sometimes when you're doing your studies, okay? What method you use is going to depend on your population. It also is going to depend upon what you're studying. So let's start off first of all with simple random sample. This is the most common. And if we say that we're taking a simple random sample of size n, so a simple random sample, say a size 5, okay? That's a sample chosen from the population in such a way that every group of n individuals from that population is equally likely to be chosen. So for example, if I have a population consisting of 4 people, say Carl, Michonne, Daryl, and Rick, and I want to choose a simple random sample of size 2, well, I could simply just think of those as like names in a bag, right? And randomly reach in and draw 2. And these would be all the possible simple random samples that I could have. So a simple random sample would be a situation where all 6 of these samples have the same likelihood of being chosen. And so this is usually the best way to choose a sample when we don't have any other information on factors that are going to affect our result. Usually a simple random sample is the best way to choose a sample. The big drawback to simple random sample, though, is that you have to know everyone in the population, and you also have to be able to randomly draw individuals from that population. And that's not always possible. Very often, if we think about a population as being adults in the United States, we don't know everyone in the United States. So a simple random sample wouldn't be possible for that population. And that's why I said the sampling method very often depends on the population. This is a good example. Now, what happens generally, however, is that we want to take a sample from a population to look at a certain variable, but we know there are other factors that affect our variable. And the question is, how do we deal with this? And it turns out there's 2 different types of sampling methods we can use called stratified and cluster that let us address this problem. So in stratified sampling, what we do is we think of the groups as strata. Okay. And essentially what this means is we have a situation where between the groups we have a lot of variation, but within the groups the individuals are relatively the same. So for example, a really good example of this is something like Boston cream pie or maybe tiramisu, right? Where you can see that each of these layers is like a strata, so each of these layers is relatively the same, but the layers themselves are very different, okay? So a really good example is if I wanted to sample, say, for example, a region, and I wanted to look at the percentage of people that were going to vote for a certain candidate, there are other factors that are going to affect who's going to vote for the candidate. So I might break the population up into various strata. For example, age could be one strata. Let's say ethnic groups could be another strata. Educational level could be another strata. Okay. On the other hand, we can have a situation where we have things that we call clusters, and essentially clusters occur when we have little variation between the groups, but we have a lot of variation within. And you can see that this peanut cluster is kind of a good example. Within the peanut cluster, there's a lot of variation, right? There's chocolate, nuts, all sorts of different things, right? So unlike the Boston cream pie, where each of the layers are relatively homogeneous, within the cluster, there's a great deal of heterogeneity. However, between clusters, there's not a lot of heterogeneity. And so this situation probably occurs a little less frequently, but it's a different situation, because what I would do in cluster sampling is I take a simple random sample of the clusters, and then I would take a simple random sample within each cluster, or maybe if the clusters were small enough, do a census or do everybody in the cluster. And that sort of sampling is called multi-stage sampling, okay? Or I'm taking a simple random sample at one stage. In this case, I take a simple random sample of the clusters, and then within each cluster, that's where the multi-stage is coming from, I might take another simple random sample. So this kind of gives you an idea of how this might work, okay? So in stratified sampling, these are my four strata, or I'm sorry, three strata in this case, right? Blue, red, and green. And the key thing is that I want to make sure that the proportions taken from the strata are proportional to their percentages in the population. So you notice, for example, there's 3 blue and 3 green and 6 red. So basically there's 1 to 2 to 1. So in my sample, there has to be 50% red, okay, 25% blue, 25% green. So if I knew I was taking a sample of size 4 using stratified sampling, I would do a simple random sample of size 1 from the blue block, a simple random sample of size 1 from the green strata, and then do a simple random sample of size 2 from the rust strata. And you notice the cluster sampling is very different. So here you see that the clusters are kind of similar. So here I just take a simple random sample of the clusters. I might have chosen randomly this cluster here and this cluster here. And since they're small enough, I would do a census. Okay, I'd take data from everybody in each cluster. And very often you do this multi-stage where you're taking a simple random sample of clusters and then a simple random sample within each cluster. In this case, however, the clusters are so small that I wouldn't have to do this second step, right? Another method that's often used is systematic sampling. So whenever we have a population where the individuals can be ordered in some sort of list or line, we can make some sort of sequence of all the people in our population. We can randomly choose a starting person and then sample every kth individual. Okay. So for example, if I wanted to do systematic sampling where I was sampling, say, every 4th person, I might randomly choose this person, and then every 3rd person after that I would choose, okay? So I chose this person, then I would wait till 1, 2, 3 people come along, choose that individual, then wait 1, 2, 3 till this person comes along and I choose them. And so for example, if a military base wanted to find out the average time it takes for cars to get through a checkpoint, they might randomly choose a starting car, record the time, and then maybe every 3rd car they would find the time it took for that car to get through the checkpoint. And the last method we can use is convenience sampling. And convenience in sampling is simply you choose a method that is convenient to you. And very often when we're dealing with human subjects, part of the sampling design involves convenience sampling. When you're taking a survey, for example, you can't force people to take a survey. So at the end, you're kind of always taking whoever you're able to get. But convenience basically means that the sampling method is simply based on one that's convenient to you. So you open up a food truck and, first you want to find out before you go ahead and set up shop what percentage of people around like your food, and you set up a stand and you hand out samples and you get responses from the people. Notice that it's really convenience sampling. You're setting up a stand and you're just taking whoever comes by. If you wanted to do it really carefully, you would set up a stand in different parts of the town maybe, or in different strata, different socioeconomic parts of a region, right? And get responses from each of them. But here you're just setting up in one spot, whoever comes by, giving them a sample, getting their response. Convenience sampling gets a bad rap, and very often people say that you should never convenience sample. It's very bad. But the reality is that sometimes it's actually the best method. So let's suppose, for example, you receive a shipment of 1,000 concrete blocks and you want to test the strength of those blocks by choosing 10 of them, okay? Now, if you wanted to do a simple random sample, you could. You'd have to number somehow all of the blocks, randomly choose 10 of them. But do you really want to go to the bottom of that stack and try to pull out blocks, okay? Or go to the middle and to the bottom? I mean, that would be incredibly inconvenient. So if you really don't have any reason to believe that the blocks at the top really are going to be any different than the blocks at the bottom, you would just take 10 blocks off the top, right? And you go ahead and test those. So sometimes practicality really trumps being overly cautious. So now we want to talk a little bit about what it is we're going to do with a sample, why we sample, how we sample properly, what the objectives of good sampling are, and what happens when we don't sample correctly. So if we go back to the big picture of statistics, right? We start off with, a question, and we go ahead and collect data. And the reality is that the population, the question that we ask really defines the population. And that actually defines how we're going to collect the data. So let me give you a really simple example, okay? And complete the picture there. I asked a question on the class survey. Are you concerned that problems regarding air and water quality will have a major effect on you? Now, if we go back to the context of that, why did I ask that question? Well, notice that the party conducting the study actually determines the purpose of that study. If the party doing the study was Embry-Riddle, okay, I might want to know if there is a demand for environmentally related classes. Are students interested in the environment? Are they concerned? That would make my population Embry-Riddle students. If I was a company, I might ask that question because I want to determine if environmental concerns are important to my customer base. So now my population is totally different. It would be all the existing and potential customers for my product. If I'm a politician, I might ask that question because I want to know if environmental issues are going to be important when I draft my party's platform. In which case, I'd have a totally different population again, which would be all the potential voters. So you see that the why, that part of the context of a data set, the purpose of the study, really determines who I'm interested in looking at. Now, what is a good study? Well, I always think of, I have all these food analogies. I'm a foodie, I'll confess. This is a kind of a good example of a sample. It's how we sample a dish. So suppose, for example, you made this, a chicken noodle soup here, okay? How do we sample it? Well, the same principles that are involved in sampling a dish are the same principles involved in sampling a population. When we sample soup, we want to make sure that all the ingredients that affect the taste are present, right? So in other words, I want to make sure that I got a little bit of carrot, a little bit of chicken, a little bit of potato, right? And so we think of the ingredients as like the subgroups. When we sample a population and we think there are subgroups that could affect our result, we want to make sure that all those different subgroups are in our sample. So if we're looking at a response to some sort of social issue, we want to make sure that we include people from all the different political groups. Make sure there's some independents, some Republicans, and some Democrats, right? In the example we were talking about with environmental issues, okay, gender might be a subgroup. We might expect that females would answer differently than males. So we want to make sure that we don't have an all-male sample or an all-female sample, or predominantly. The other thing also is that not only do the ingredients have to be in the spoon, but they should also be in the same proportion as they are in the soup. So if I have a whole lot of carrots in the soup, well, then my spoon better have a whole lot of carrots in it, right? Otherwise, what's in the spoon's not going to taste the same necessarily as what's in the soup. And so this kind of goes back to how we do sampling, especially stratified sampling, right? We want the subgroups in our sample to be represented in proportion to their presence in the actual population. So in our example of the environmental issue question, we know that roughly 30% of the Embry-Riddle students are female, so we'd want our sample to have about 30% females. It turns out that this is actually not so easy to do. This is a part of statistics that we call experimental design, and we know that sometimes it doesn't work. We know in the last presidential election that in fact the sampling methods they use didn't give the correct results. Sometimes that's due to the sampling, but sometimes it's just the luck of the draw. So the best we can do is just use methods that are reliable. In other words, they give good results a very high percentage of time. And so the two key ideas we use to get good samples are, first of all, we make sure that the individuals are randomly chosen. And this is kind of equivalent to stirring the pot, right? So the idea is we want to make sure that our population is kind of mixed up very well, so we're not just sampling from one area that's predominantly from a certain subgroup, which is going to produce bias. Okay. And we also want to make sure our sample size is sufficiently large, and this is a little tricky. The larger the sample size we have, the better our results are going to be. We kind of all know that. It's going to reduce the error in our results, like we talked about last time. But you have to be a little careful, because after a while, getting a larger sample doesn't really improve the accuracy of our results that much. So after a while, after a certain point, the sample size is really independent of the population. Okay, in other words, no matter how big our population is, a certain sample size will suffice. If you think about a soup, after a while, the size of the spoon doesn't matter. Okay, you're able to properly sample, and having a spoon any larger really doesn't help you get a better idea of what the soup is actually like. So to kind of go back in a big picture sort of way and think about populations and samples, okay? We said before that we have some population, in this case, if we go back to our environmental question, we said our population was all the Embry-Riddle students. And the thing that we're interested in, that's called the parameter. In this case, it's the percentage of concerned students in the population. And so we say that a parameter is just some number that describes a property of the variable we're looking at. So the variable we're looking at is whether or not students are concerned. And the number that really kind of describes what's important about that variable is the percentage of the students that are concerned in the population. So that's our parameter. Now, a statistic is anything that's computed from a sample. So in this case, what would I do with my sample? Well, I generally can't get the parameter. In this case, I couldn't get the percentage of concerned students in the entire population. So what would I do? Well, I'd take that sample and I'd compute the percentage of concerned students in my sample, right? And that would be a statistic. The percentage of concerned students in the sample would be a number that I computed from that sample, or a statistic. And so now we kind of see what the purpose of a sample is really from a statistical viewpoint. The purpose of the sample is to get data that allows us to compute statistics that estimate the population properties, or the population parameters, you might say. And sampling really affects our estimates in two ways. And the way I like to think about this is I like to think about a bullseye, okay? So we have this bullseye and the target that we're trying, we have this target, and the bullseye is what we're trying to hit. And so that's essentially equivalent to our population parameter. That's the number that we're trying to reach, right? Now notice that when you have a random sample, in other words, you sampled properly, and you have a large sample, okay, so you have an accurate estimate and you have a precise estimate. In other words, you have a cluster that's centered at the bullseye. That's because it was randomly sampled, and the cluster is very tight, and that's because the sample was large. Now, what happens if we use a non-random sample that's very large? Well, this is essentially equivalent to a cluster that's off target. Why? Because we've oversampled from a certain subgroup, and that's caused that subgroup we've oversampled to be overrepresented, and now our sample is not representative of the population. Okay. So that's this case in the upper right-hand corner. Okay. So here we have a very large sample, but we didn't sample properly. So we have this bias. This bias is this deviation between where our values are clustered and where we're trying to estimate. Okay, the middle of the target of the bullseye. Now, conversely, the bottom left-hand plate shows what happens when we have a sample that's been correctly obtained. Okay, we took a random sample, but we don't have a large sample. Notice now that our values are clustered around the right value, but there's a lot of spread. And finally, in the bottom right-hand plate, we have a situation where we've sampled incorrectly and we have a small sample. So in other words, we're centered off target and the spread is really big. And so this is how the sampling method and the sample size affect our estimate. If we have large sample sizes, we see that our estimates are really tightly clustered together, which is good. And they're clustered about whatever the true value is for the population we sampled from. And if we sample correctly, that cluster is right around the value that we're actually trying to estimate, okay, our actual target value in a sense, or the population parameter. So how do we sample randomly? Well, this is actually not as easy as you might think. There are a lot of physical lotteries we can do, like we can put things in a bag and draw them, or mix things up, right, and draw them. And it turns out these things aren't as random as we think we think they might be. A really good example is the draft that was done in the Vietnam War. And I kind of encourage you to read this little Wikipedia stuff. It's fascinating what happened. And the reason why often drawings like this are not random is because humans tend to be biased in different ways. And I won't go into this, but we're essentially going to skirt the whole issue by using a computer to do the sampling for us. And that way we don't have to depend on human bias because the computer is going to do all of our sampling. So let's go and see how to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into StatCrunch and we're going to draw a random sample of a specified size. Okay. And the way we do this in general, not just with StatCrunch, is we have to have a data set where all the individuals are listed in some sort of column or a sequence. And then we're going to read that data set into some sort of software program. In this case, it's StatCrunch. And then we're going to have the computer randomly draw a fixed number, a specified number of individuals from that list without replacement. And without replacement means once an individual is drawn, it's not put back into the population. So once it comes out of the bag, it stays out of the bag. And let's see how we do that with StatCrunch. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that data set we just loaded into StatCrunch, the class roster data set, and we're going to choose a random sample of size 3. So the first thing we do is we go to data and we choose sample. Okay, so I go here and I'm going to go to data and I'm going to go to sample. So now I'm going to take a random sample from my data set. I click here. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to choose the variable that I want to do something to. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and choose the variable student because I want to sample from the list of students. I'm going to choose the sample size. In other words, I want to draw 3 people from that list. So I have a sample size of 3. And I only want to draw 1 sample. I'm not going to click with replacement because I don't want that. So I'm just going to enter these 3 pieces of information and then click compute. And what you'll see is that a random sample that has 3 student names will appear in another column. Okay, so I'm going to click on the variable I'm interested in doing something with. I want to select 3 students randomly, and I want 1 sample of size 3, and I click compute. And you notice these are the 3 students that were randomly selected. And of course, you'll have a different 3 because that's the whole point of a random sample, right? Your random sample most likely won't be the same as mine. And in fact, if I did this again, if I chose another random sample, you'll see it'll be different. Okay, so none of these names in the first sample are the same as the second, and that's not a surprise. So that's how we're going to do random sampling, and we're going to do a lot. We're going to see that random sampling is not only good for choosing samples, but it's actually really good when we're doing the analysis later on. There's a method called bootstrapping that we use, which is actually very valuable, very, very useful. So the last thing we have to talk about is this issue of data types. It turns out that data is classified in one of 2 ways, and how we classify the data is going to determine how we analyze it, and that's why the data types are actually important. So to start off, we can either have categorical or qualitative data or quantitative data. And categorical data basically are variables where the values represent classes or levels or labels or identifiers. So to give you an example, one type of categorical variable is gender. Gender can have 2 values, male or female, and those values are kind of like bins, right, or classes that we put people in, or categories if you wish. Notice that things like zip codes and student ID numbers, while they're numbers, they're actually identifiers, right? A zip code basically identifies people in a certain geographical area. Student ID identifies a particular student. And finally, we can have variables that represent a degree of something or a scale. So for example, like a pain scale, a satisfaction level, the educational level of a person, right? These are values that represent categories, but the categories can be ordered. That's the key point. The categories can be ordered. So here, for the first one, the categories are like bins. For the second one, the categories are like identifiers. And for the last one, we have categories that represent levels, so they can be ordered. Quantitative data are variables where the values represent the amount of the quantity. That's why it's called quantitative. And generally, quantitative variables have units. There are a few exceptions, but we're not going to deal with them. So we're going to say, for our purposes, the way that we can unequivocally recognize a quantitative data type is that it has units. So 2 of the most common types of quantitative data we're going to run across are basically physically measured quantities. So any sort of physical property like height, temperature, length, etc., anything with units at all, that's going to be quantitative data type. And the other one is count data. So if we count the number of items we have, the number of coins in our pocket, the number of cars in a parking lot, money, for example, is quantitative because we're counting the number of cents that we have. When you think about it, count data also has units. It's units of the units. It's units of whatever item it is you're counting, right? So if we want to determine what sort of data type a particular variable has, the way we determine the data type for a variable is we ask 2 questions. The first question we ask is, what values can the variable take on? So let's suppose the variable was gender. We're collecting information on the gender of people in our sample. What values can the variable gender take on? Male or female, right? And then we ask the question, which of these most are most like our variable? Do the values represent categories? Are they more like that? Or are they more like representing the amount of some quantity? And one way you can kind of answer that second question is you can start off and say, is your data numerical? Well, if it's not, it's automatically categorical. If it is, then we have to do a little more work, because remember, for example, zip code is numerical data, but it's not quantitative, right? So when we have to ask the second question, do the values have units? If the answer is yes, it's quantitative. If the answer is no, it's categorical. And I'll just mention, although we're not going to use this a great deal, is that each of these data types actually has a sub-classification. So categorical data types can be broken down into nominal. In other words, these are cases where the variable values really are just names, like male, female, the values are names. Or ordinal. These are values that can be ordered. Okay, so when the values represent classes, they're nominal. When they represent ordered classes, they're ordinal. And quantitative can be broken down into two different classes also. The one is discrete. In other words, this is usually used for count data, right? The idea behind discrete is that you can order the values in between any two consecutive values. There's no values in between them. Continuous is usually more for physically measurable quantities, and here the values essentially fill up an interval. And I'm not going to get into the fine points of these sub-classifications, but if you do more statistics, it becomes relevant then. And for some of your projects, it may also become relevant. So let's go ahead and try to identify the data type for each variable. So suppose we classify the stages of cancer where 1 is the least advanced stage of cancer and 4 is the most advanced stage of cancer. What sort of data type would we call this? Would it be categorical or quantitative? Notice the values, 1, 2, 3, 4, they're numerical, right? So what's the question when we ask, when we have numerical data, does it have units? And the answer is no. So this really represents classes, and in fact this is ordinal data, right? These numbers just stand for different stages. They don't represent the quantity. So the answer is categorical, and the reason why is because the numbers stand for categories, or levels if you wish. How many children in a household? Well, that's count data, so that's quantitative. Price of the stock? Well, that's going to be, again, either count data, or you can think of it as, the data has units, which is dollars, either way. And so price of the stock has to be quantitative. Area code. We notice that area code, like stages of cancer, is numerical, but again, it's really categorical because it's basically an identifier. A person's age. Well, here you have to be kind of careful because age can be both categorical and quantitative. In this case, if we don't specify anything beyond just asking for the variable, we generally assume it can be either one, that it's quantitative. So here I would say it's quantitative because a person's actual age is basically measuring the amount of time that they've been alive in units of years. However, people can also be grouped, so by age, right? So you can have age groups, infant, child, adolescent, etc. But we didn't say age group, we said age. So we're going to assume then that it is quantitative. And of course, that naturally leads into the next variable, a person's age group. So here, notice I've taken the same variable age, but now I've grouped people from with respect to their proximity in age, right? So that's clearly categorical. Social Security number, well, it is numerical, but it's really an identifier. So since it's an identifier, it's categorical. Now, why do we care about what data type we have? Well, the reason why is if we go back to the big picture, right, of statistics, we start with a problem, we collect data, and then we have to summarize. And so this is the key point. It turns out that the way we summarize the data depends on the data type. So if we think about the types of graphs we make, okay, for categorical, we make bar plots, pie charts, or tables. We're going to talk about that. And for quantitative, we make different types of plots. We make histograms, box plots, and scatter plots. If we think about the types of numerical summaries or statistics that we can compute from each of the data sets, well, with categorical data, all you can do is count the number in each category. So you can just get the counts in each category or the percentage of the sample in each category. Whereas with quantitative data, you can compute many things, the mean, the standard deviation, percentiles, and so on. So notice that the way we summarize the data, whether it's graphically or numerically, depends on its data type. That's a very important thing to remember. Okay. So these are the key points, okay? The important thing about data is the context. We have to know the 6 questions that are involved in determining the context of the data set and know how to answer those 6 questions. We said the purpose of sampling was to compute things from samples that we call statistics that estimate numerical properties of the variable we're interested in, which are called parameters, from the population, that is. 3 key principles to choosing a good sample. The sample has to be representative of a population. We want to randomly choose those samples, people that are going to be in our samples. We want to make sure that the sample sizes are large enough. And finally, we know that data is classified according to its type, either categorical or quantitative. Sometimes people will say qualitative for categorical. I'll usually say categorical though. And the reason why data type is important is because the type of data we have dictates how we're going to summarize that data. So these are some vocabulary words that you should know and be familiar with and look at. And so at this point, you're pretty much ready to read chapter 1 and start on the homework. Again, the reading for the text is not going to really correspond to this PowerPoint. The next 2 lectures will correspond a lot more to this PowerPoint, but for now, this will give you a good start and prepare you for Wednesday's class. The homework, however, is primarily from this PowerPoint. Okay, I think that's all for now. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I know since the material is not in the book, there may be some things that you're still a little unclear about.